Hey y'all, it's entry number 63 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver, Indianapolis Colts. We'll start with the positives with Michael Pittman's fantasy profile. QB upgrade. Pittman got a QB upgrade this offseason as the team goes from Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan has thrown at least 20 touchdowns in every single season from 2009 to 2021 and has thrown for 4,000 or more passing yards in 10 of his last 11 seasons in the league. In addition, Ryan has shown a high passing ceiling in the past, with 2 seasons of over 4,900 passing yards in 2016 and 2018, and has even won an MVP back in 2016. Getting a QB upgrade should only help Pittman for fantasy purposes. The next thing I really like about Michael Pittman's fantasy profile is that he's the number 1 receiving option on the Colts. Michael Pittman established himself as a clear number 1 receiver on the Indianapolis Colts in 2021. He had the 12th highest target share with 25.9% and the 7th highest WR target share with 45.5% among wide receivers in the 2021 season, according to an article by Scott Rainier on Fantasy Data. By being a top target on his team, it makes it easier to trust Pittman for fantasy purposes. The last thing I really like about Michael Pittman's fantasy profile is that he's a growing young talent. Michael Pittman has already put up an impressive stat line of 88 receptions on 129 targets for 1,082 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns in just his second year in the league. He will be entering just his 3rd year in the NFL in 2022, and there's a strong possibility that he continues to improve and put up better numbers in the future. Moving on to some of the concerns with Michael Pittman's fantasy profile. Run-heavy offense. The Indianapolis Colts offense ran through Jonathan Taylor last year, giving him 332 carries, and the team in general ran the ball 499 times. Because of their run-heavy approach, the Colts ended up ranking just 27th in the league in passing attempts in 2021, with 521. This lower number of passing attempts makes it slightly more difficult for Pittman to put up monster fantasy numbers. The next major concern I have with Michael Pittman's fantasy profile is that his head coach, Frank Reich, doesn't have a great track record with fantasy wide receivers. Frank Reich's wide receiver room as a whole has averaged a below average 18.86 wide receiver targets per game over the course of his career in an offensive coordinator or head coaching role. In that time, he's only had 2 wideouts go over 1,000 receiving yards. T.Y. Hilton in 2018 with 1,270 receiving yards, and Michael Pittman in 2021 with 1,082 receiving yards. The most targets that one of his receivers has gotten prior to Michael Pittman last year was Keenan Allen with 121 back in 2014. Reich's offense may put a cap on Pittman's ceiling, which obviously isn't very good for fantasy purposes. The last major concern I have with Michael Pittman's fantasy profile is that he's not elite in yards per route run or target or reception quite yet. Michael Pittman isn't necessarily inefficient, but given he's generally going off the board as a top 20 fantasy wideout now, you have to be a little pickier about his profile. In 2021, Michael Pittman averaged 2.19 yards per route run, the 19th best among wide receivers, 8.4 yards per target, the 37th best among wide receivers, 12.3 yards per reception, the 58th best among wide receivers, 0.47 fantasy points per route run, the 24th best among wide receivers, and 1.85 fantasy points per target, the 40th best among wide receivers, according to Player Profiler. Again, these numbers aren't bad, just more mediocre and slightly below some of the other elite fantasy wide receivers going in Pittman's draft range. Some additional thoughts on Michael Pittman's fantasy profile. In the 2021 season, Michael Pittman finished as the WR16 in standard with 150.6 total fantasy points and 8.9 fantasy points per game. The WR15 in half PPR formats with 194.6 total fantasy points and 11.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR17 in full PPR formats, with 238.6 total fantasy points and 14.0 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, Michael Pittman had 4 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 17 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. The Indianapolis Colts drafted wide receiver Alec Pierce in the second round of the 2022 NFL Draft. It remains to be seen how Pierce will impact Pittman's target share. Personal opinion: Michael Pittman is currently going off the board as WR16, about pick 42 overall on ESPN, and WR13, about pick 35 overall on Yahoo. I view him as a WR2 and think that his ESPN draft spot is in the right ballpark. Maybe slightly high for my personal taste, but his Yahoo draft range seems pretty costly right now, as he's one of the most expensive guys in that wide receiver tier from the WR13 range to the WR20 range. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Michael Pittman's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the National Stuttering Association. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's all for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.